Thank you, Sarah Jane, and hello everyone, welcome. I guess I should introduce my fun fact since I was without a partner, and one of the ones that I often tell is that my actual birth name was Maxine Claudia Clarke. So that's what was on my birth certificate. And when I graduated from university, the first degree as an undergraduate, I changed my name about 2 weeks before graduation. My parents came to graduation, and I received an award, and as I walked on the stage, I took the opportunity to make the announcement in front of the university of my new name. And that new name at the time was Kamari Aduke. And my mother was so shocked and upset that after the graduation, she said she was going to give me money because I had no more money left at the end of the semester. And she wrote a check to me in the name Kamari Aduke, and I couldn't cash it. So thus my name, when I changed my name, I actually changed it to Maxine Kamari Clarke and told everyone to call me Kamari Clarke. So that's why Kamari Clarke is the name I use, but I've never let go of the Maxine since everyone prior to 1988 called me Max. So Max was actually the name I was referred to by. So that's my fun fact. The other fun fact that I think my colleagues didn't mention about, at least those on the organizing committee, is that Felix, his actual name during the course of the 2-year planning was Minister of Education. So we would have these meetings on Skype and then later on Zoom, and when we would refer to an agenda item that had to do with the curriculum for the summer school, we would say Minister of Education, and Alphonse was Minister of Logistics. And so over the course of this week, I'm sure we'll have more ministers playing key roles, and I suspect one of my PhD students, Wumi, will probably be the Minister of Social Activities. Okay, so I'll just jump right in to my talk for today. It's so wonderful to be here, and I'll jump right in. The talk is entitled, Thinking International Justice Otherwise. Just this month, in July 2022, the French Court of Law operating under universal jurisdiction found 70-year-old Laurent Bisseburta, a former senior Rwandan official, guilty of complicity in genocide and sentenced him to 20 years in prison. While he denied involvement in the killings, he expressed regret over a failure to act to prevent them. His lawyers called on the court to exercise courage in acquitting him. Ultimately, though, the court found him to be complicit because of his participation in meetings deemed to have been sites of planning the atrocities, as well as his role in persuading thousands to take refuge in the Marambi Technical School that became the site of the mass execution in Rwanda. In fields of international law and sociological studies, over the past 20 years, approaches to justice have focused on remedies epitomized by this French court decision, fixating on the rule of law and ending impunity as solutions for preventing violence. Yet in reality, applying the force of these remedies profoundly unevenly, aimed again and again at the fixtures of African perpetrators. What justice will there be for the hundreds who die daily in pursuit of safer futures for themselves and their families, such as in the US-Mexico desert, the Mediterranean Sea, the English Channel? What of those victimized by mass atrocity violence who still continue to suffer the effects of violence? What about families in Palestine stripped of land and life? The disappeared and children murdered in Mexico, Nigeria, Ukraine, and Syria. Black American, Latinx, and indigenous civilians murdered again and again by the police. Farmers in Somalia and Kenya who can no longer survive the effects of climate change. What type of international tools would be required to achieve some measure of equitable justice for individuals and for communities caught in the machinations of war, capitalism, the vicious effects of post-coloniality, white supremacy, and climate change? We are gathered at this institute charged with the task of rethinking futures of justice beyond the limits of the law. To do this, we must begin to think otherwise, to think of international justice as being otherwise than what we've inherited and taken for granted. Now, also in July 2022, UCLA anthropology professor Joseph Manson's blog post went viral. Entitled, "Why I'm Giving Up Tenure at UCLA, the ideological takeover of my university has ruined my academic life for anyone who still believes in freedom of thought." It was picked up by social media influencer Barry Weiss, sympathetic to his position, and sparked a public conversation. Manson's piece berated left-leaning scholars and lamented the pre-2000 period of what he saw as academic tranquility in which everyone got along. And there, of course, included a semblance of academic standards. With a provocative preface to Manson's repost, Weiss offered a metaphor for making sense of Manson's plight, that of a leopard. As she explained, and I quote, "Most people who leave their jobs as professors these days do not do so because they have a choice. They leave because they're pushed out by ideological bullies. But Professor Manson is leaving of his own volition. Why? In large part because he understands the nature of leopards. If the leopard is currently eating the face of the person in the cubicle next to me, what will stop him from eating mine?" End quote. Yet if we examine the politics of knowledge production with a structural, historical, and critical lens, one of the questions that we must ask is, who are the real leopards, and whose freedoms are truly being trampled? For many racialized and marginalized scholars, academic work is not simply an objective act disarticulated from life. Rather, it is about excavating a lived past, a past of subordination, a past denied, a past that can never be fully known in some cases, yet daily asserts itself upon the present. Following late Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, critical scholarship from the position of intersectionality, the exploited and excluded, is about rejecting the historical domination of Eurocentric capitalist leopards, and instead creating and empowering a form of speech and an explanatory domain that is creative, that is life-defending and life-producing. Termed talking back, her academic positioning gave her a site from which to clarify her place in the world, a place of meaning-making, quite literally, a life. As Hooks recounts, and I quote, "That initial act of talking back outside the home was empowering. It was the first of many acts of defiant speech that would make it possible for me to emerge as an independent thinker and writer. In retrospect, talking back became for me a rite of initiation, testing my courage, strengthening my commitment, preparing me for the days ahead." She continued, "Moving from silence into speech is for the oppressed, the colonized, the exploited, and those who stand and struggle side by side, a gesture of defiance that heals, that makes new life and new growth possible. It is that act of speech, of talking back, that is no mere gesture of empty words. That is the expression of our movement from object to subject, the liberated voice." End quote. So in this light, I'd like to encourage us in this experience we're creating together to allow it to be a space for talking back, both from and across our differences and with the strength of our convergences. Popular depictions of leopards in African contexts revere them, and in some places even more than lions. Leopards are celebrated as the ultimate symbol of power, not only because of their courage, but because of their creative tenacity. So let us resignify and creatively remake what it means to be leopards in our pursuit of a better future for justice. This is about a future where we dare to imagine justice not only in relation to legality, its instruments, classifications, and decontextualizations of harm, but also outside of it as a way to recontextualize what it means to be human. As we dialogue and deliberate over these days, I want to encourage us to embrace the notion that critically considers this question about new and emerging knowledge as justice understood otherwise. This is about claiming the ability to speak, to take issue, to demand recognition as qualities that intimately relate to justice. It is about justice writ large. It's about the ability to engage in imagining and fashioning a world where tools and concepts can emancipate. Yet we must begin where we are now, and with reckoning on how we got there. What does it mean, actually, to think justice otherwise in a world set on the use of international law tools, at once coarse and rarefied in deeply political and socio-historical contexts? Well, in international justice circles, there are two key tenets that mark popular arenas for the articulation of justice over the past 30 years. And I'll just pick these particular two for the purposes of the through line in this talk. One of them has to do with the language of transitional justice that was first clarified through the range of truth commissions that we saw the world over. And the second was the historic move to legal accountability mechanisms, which propelled a language of individualization of criminal responsibility. Now, transitional justice forms in post-conflict situations have ranged, we know, from truth commissions and reparations, and eventually that also and significantly included criminal prosecutions. The term transitional justice, as we know, was used to describe the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the transitions unfolding at the time in Latin America from the late 1980s. Some used the term transitional justice to describe the problem of the rule of law in periods of radical political change that were linked to the rule of law dilemma. That is, inherent to the problems of successor justice, constitutional beginnings, and constitutional change. As we know, moments of transition are often characterized by these massive paradigm shifts in understanding justice as societies struggle with how to transform their political, their legal, their economic systems. Another thing we know is that there existed a 1997 report to the United Nations on human rights, the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities, titled The Administration of Justice and the Human Rights Detainees. Now here, Louis Joynet described a set of principles for the protection and promotion of human rights through action to combat impunity, which formed the basis for the United Nations approach to transitional justice. And as I outlined in the guidance note to the Secretary General of the United Nations approach to transitional justice. And these principles, many of us know, were mapped out according to 4 key pillars of transitional justice. They had to do with principles of truth, with justice, with reparations, and with the guarantee of non-recurrence. Now, we know that truth was seen through truth-seeking and articulated as the right to know, as well as involving a range of extrajudicial commissions that have unfolded over the last 30 years, issues having to do with guaranteed independence and impartiality, safeguards for witnesses, publicity for commissions, reports, the preservation of archives, etc. The right to justice had to do with the right, of course, to a fair and effective remedy to violence, restrictions justified by the desire to combat impunity, prescriptions for wrongdoing. It included amnesty, the right to asylum, extradition, trial in absentia, and on. There was the right to reparation involved restitution, and of course this had to do with compensation and rehabilitation and seeking to restore victims to their previous state. And then the final, of course, was the guarantees of non-repetition in a reformed future. And this involved the disbandment of various armed groups, including parastatal armed groups, the repeal of emergency laws, some of them that ultimately made possible the kind of violence that we saw in those various contexts. By 2006, you'll recall that the United Nations indicated a recognition of the importance of transitional justice to international human rights when it put the responsibility for transitional justice in the UN under the purview of the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. However, if we look at the prehistory of truth commissions as a key tenet of early transitional justice modalities, we know that various states implemented truth commissions and other quasi-judicial mechanisms with the goal of achieving political transition through performative truth-telling. One of the first truth commissions in the African continent was the Commission of Inquiry into the Disappearances of the People in Uganda, and that was held in 1974 during the Idi Amin dictatorship. And by the 1980s, there were waves of democratization. We certainly saw this in Latin America, in which activists were demanding accountability mechanisms for adjudicating human rights abuses under authoritarian regimes. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, known as the TRC, inaugurated in 1995 and commencing in 1996, continued these developments, but introduced the language of truth recovery, as well as forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation. The South African TRC was among the first to popularize transitional justice as a tool for human rights and for facilitating the transition to new democratic forms of civic participation. In the aftermath of widespread systematic violence in South Africa, emotion-propelled discourses of forgiveness were ubiquitous, and various publics were compelled to engage in sentimentalizing affects of performing forgiveness as a narrative trope. This forgiveness marked a context in which South Africa was transitioning from a white supremacist society with a white dominant cultural hegemony supported by apartheid laws, which upheld such forms of domination. The new South African government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to document the, quote, truth about past violence of the ruling apartheid government and repair the consequences of race-based exclusions that structured South African life. The objective stated, the stated objective was to lead the nation through a collective transition from wounding and anger of victims of white supremacist apartheid toward a public life in which South Africa's white dominant cultural worlds could be forgiven and dominant institutions could be fundamentally continued. It was moralized that those who were able to forgive would gain the freedom of healing and be ultimately better off than those who were unable to do so. So of course this was the narrative, this was the discourse. Chaired by the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the TRC centered themes of individual guilt, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Rather than institutional change or reparations, what we saw was the deploying of a religiously infused logic built not only on a moral basis, but also on a deeply emotional and affective one. Bishop Tutu took the opportunity to preach that forgiveness should inhabit the spaces opened up by truth-telling. As he has uttered passionately time and time again, the wounds of hatred and anger that had been created in the apartheid system must not overtake the society. He said, and I quote, "There was no place for retaliation in the new society that emerged after independence," end quote. Describing the TRC as an incubation chamber for national healing, reconciliation, and forgiveness, he insisted, and I quote, "When I talk of forgiveness, I mean the belief that you can come out on the other side a better person. a better person than the one being consumed by anger and hatred. If you can find it in yourself to forgive, then you are no longer chained to the perpetrator. You can move on, and you can even help the perpetrator become a better person too, end quote. Now, while sentimental forgiveness strategies centered on the individual were at times critiqued, their performance was seductive. Certainly seductive for the world, for those of us watching on during this period, and ultimately effective in conferring legitimacy to new forms of governance. During one TRC hearing, a witness, the teenage daughter of someone victimized by apartheid's violence, described the incident in which her relatives were murdered. And I quote, "The police ambushed their car, killed them in the most gruesome manner, set the car alight." End quote. When asked whether she would forgive the person who did this to her family, she answered, and I quote, "We would like to forgive, but we just don't know who to forgive." End quote. In this case, as in so many, victims reckoned with the absence of an individualized perpetrator, even as the overarching role of apartheid structures, white racism, histories of inequality, and high-ranking leaders were also omitted and glossed over. Neither individual perpetrators nor broader institutions were under judgment. Rather, individual victims were compelled to perform an emotional transition from the powerless of being harmed to the power of forgiving, even in the absence of any particular vector of their forgiveness. Albie Sachs, a former ANC activist, underscored how central the TRC's opening hearings were, and I quote, he says, "To me, the most important part of the Truth Commission was not the report. It was the seeing on television of the tears, the laments, the stories, the acknowledgements," end quote. This utterance by Sachs highlights the ways in which emotional displays related to the experience of violence were central to the conversion of those experiences and the way that they propelled forward new states of reconciliation. Also, as noted by former Minister of Justice Dola Omar, the commission was, and I quote, "a necessary exercise to enable South Africans to come to terms with their past on a morally accepted basis and to advance the cause of reconciliation." Apartheid had oppressed generations of South Africans and led to the escalation of conflict resulting in violence and human rights abuses. No section of society escaped these abuses. As a response to the far-reaching consequences of apartheid, the TRC forums required moral and emotional performances that imposed forgiveness as necessary in order to usher in social buy-in to a post-apartheid landscape. In the TRC context, forgiveness functioned to make the legalistic process appear successful in terms of its power to transform society while actually serving to preserve and even reinforce much of the status quo. An illusion of justice was realized without true reparative change. Yet for many, trying to forgive the injustices of apartheid violence involved two dualities that were not morally equivalent. They involved forgiving state agents who were paid to uphold racism, but they also involved reconciling the loss of loved ones who died in the struggle and the pain and suffering of those who survived, who committed their lives to fighting human rights, for human rights. In the end, the TRC offered amnesties to agents of the South African Defense Force, therefore placing the burden on forgiveness of survivors rather than holding perpetrators of apartheid violence accountable for their wrongdoing. And this phenomenon, of course, was not beyond critique. This isn't new. The critique isn't new. But it's important to acknowledge that it was not only just forgiveness that prevailed in these spaces of engagement, but also non-forgiveness, the refusal to reconcile the harm done, and the need to rearticulate a different term and different terms for accountability and new aspirations for the future. This refusal took many forms that shared a common thread of refusal to concede to loss without recognition of both state-sanctioned nature of that loss or attempts to rectify the unresolved nature of that loss. Acts of refusal also indexed more transformative possibilities for the future. The sense that in not conceding to violence, one might instead begin to reimagine a new horizon of reconciliation. Whether those victimized by violence offered or refused forgiveness, the overall community of perpetrators did not generally acknowledge their wrongdoings during that process, or relinquish their privileges, in fact. Ultimately, the TRC experiment provided the terms for a state ritual that promised to transition South Africa from a legally inscribed race-based socioeconomic statecraft fueled by the threat of violence to one in which the formalized legality of apartheid could be abandoned and social repair exercised. In reality, what emerged in South Africa was the maintenance of racial and economic inequality, fueled by various forms of enduring and embedded violence. So how can we make sense of this failed instrument of transnational justice or transitional justice? In part, the non-performativity of forgiveness functioned in South Africa to restore the condition of impunity that white South African perpetrators enjoyed before and after the political transition, with little change in the day-to-day inequalities endured by Black South Africans. Now, to think of this and these practices, these forgiveness performances as non-performatives, pushes us to think about what a non-performative actually is. Now, a non-performative is where speech acts work not by producing the effects it names, but by simply naming the desired result. So naming forgiveness, naming the willingness to move on. For John Austin, the sociolinguist theorist, failed performatives are unhappy, whereby the condition required for the action to succeed go unmet. But in taking seriously Sarah Ahmed's argument about these non-performatives, if a performative is measured through the idea that speech produces effects, so I now marry you, man and wife, or I forgive you, right? That speech produces effects. Then a non-performative does the opposite and is a useful way to explain the marked challenges of early transitional justice models. What we see here is how forgiveness discourses can function as non-performatives, as we saw deployed in so many transitional justice contexts on the African continent, including Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Nigeria, Chad, Morocco. At a typical event in which various Rwandans were gathered, a well-known musician of peace activists spoke about how God had showed him the way, and that because of the church's moral and political culpability during the genocide, he was surprised that people found it hard to forgive Christians. He stressed that for him, and I quote, forgiveness had nothing to do with the perpetrator, but rather meant as a release from the bondage of hatred. So that's the speech act and that's the performative. He reminded his constituencies that it was human beings who did this. The world should learn from Rwanda, he said. We live in a world where the culture of revenge reigns, he continues. Revenge should be one permanent attitude. End quote. Now, a woman on the same podium added that sometimes being a Christian can complicate forgiveness because of the undue pressure on Christians to forgive others. But in clarifying different forms of forgiveness, she drew a distinction between psychological forgiveness and Christian forgiveness, which she described as being based on the fact that God has forgiven me, end of quote. Then, after a short silence, she reflected, and I quote again, "That's quite overwhelming for me. If God can forgive me, who am I not to forgive others?" End quote. So here, by considering these speech acts, the range of examples that I've shared that produce non-performatives in forgiveness domains, what we see is that utterances can sometimes function as a claim to action. But the lack of a real-world consequence is not because the speech act failed in its commitment. It's because sometimes its failure to move beyond, to provide sustenance and life and the kind of political economy in which people can thrive in their world, is actually part of the transitional justice model. Rather than the speech equating the doing, that is, it is not saying something that leads to an action, but in the moment of saying, the speech is the action itself. Through the study of the workings of forgiveness, non-performatives, we see ways of understanding the social politics of an action as a new domain for thinking through earlier forms of transitional justice impact, not as failure, but as a function of transitional justice itself. So in other words, the failure of the Speech Act to do what it says is not the failure of intent or even circumstance, but is actually what the Speech Act is doing. So it is not failing. The late 20th century prevalence, or it's meant to do what it's doing, but it's not necessarily going beyond what it's doing. So the late 20th century prevalence of transitional justice, with its early focus on truth and forgiveness, victims' rights movements, successfully challenged the persistence of impunity in these speech acts by mobilizing a competing set of discourses focused on holding perpetrators accountable. For just as that earlier reconciliation model and truth and reconciliation model had centered on forgiveness and reconciliation of individual victims, it didn't always produce transformative justice. In fact, the emergent international justice retributive model emphasized the culpability of individual perpetrators, that no one is above and beyond the law. Its aspirations were expansive, but also didn't always lead to transformation. Yet the shift from truth and reconciliation to retributive justice approaches was seen as the answer to ending impunity, the impunity of the TRCs of the past. This was seen as justice with teeth. So moving then to the second case, by the end of the 20th century, international criminal law discourses, as we know, were broadly popularized as building on behalf as working on behalf of victims of mass atrocity violence. And to understand the causes and consequences of this rise of a new anti-impunity justice trend, we must consider such emergent formations not just in relation to the public demands for criminal trials that followed the kind of non-performatives of the TRCs, but also in relation to the public demands for solutions forged within a paradigm of protectionism. As we know, in shifting from forgiveness and development priorities to judicial measures, the popular definition of justice became a language of accountability. Such impetus presumed that accountability was required for peace, and such discourses were closely linked to the development of human rights discourses, as we know. It involved redress for abuses during repressive rule or periods of conflict, and was a way to indicate that no one, of course, is beyond the law. This discourse became narrower and more restrictive, as legal context constrained those whose suffering counted as deserving of material justice and whose harmful actions were legible within a particular mechanism for punishment. The dialectic of the individual victim, quote, to be saved, in counterpoint with the individual perpetrator, quote, is broadcast as a kind of straw man for collective justice and the deterrence for future violence. Whether by design or not, such legal mechanisms, which have invariably centered on holding high-ranking and in many cases African perpetrators accountable, have, like the forgiveness rituals of the TRCs, allowed for continued evasion of accountability by institutions that have played central roles in creating the conditions for widespread and ongoing violence, for impunity and inequality in the first place. This gap reflects the kind of non-performatives that are at play here too. But there are key ways to think otherwise about justice possibilities in such contexts. One question is to ask, what should be the relationship between speech and lived categories that people occupy? The other is, how far back should international law or international justice go to parse culpability for the structural foundations of ethnic hatred that prompted the decimation and killing, including right here, the killing in 1994 in Rwanda. Recall where we are today. More than 800 Rwandans were killed as a result of the hateful logic of cleansing and eradication, defined, of course, legally as a genocide that was directed against a particular group, the Tutsis, and that also led to the related deaths of smaller numbers of those who opposed those killings. This form of targeted violence, this genocide, was the result of many factors not unrelated to the particularities, as we know, of colonialism, the circumstances of neo-colonialism, including ethnocentrism, political oppression, histories of human rights abuses, social injustices, poverty, and economic degradation. According to the established literature, prior to the arrival of the German and Belgian colonizers in Rwanda, the social boundaries between the Hutsis and Tutsis were quite fluid. And in fact, key pre-colonial distinctions were often based on livelihood. Hutus, usually farmers, and Tutsis, predominantly cattle breeders, rather than physical or inherited traits. And as we know, there are also the Twa, seen often described as an Aboriginal group that were seen as or narrativized as the hunter-gatherers. But with the establishment of German colonialism, European racial theories were imposed and ethnic lines solidified as essentialist categories. Of course, this isn't new to us, but let me just get through the argument and thinking about its connection to where we are now with international criminal justice. Tutsis, of course, seen to have more European features within a cosmology of scientific racism, were deemed by Belgian colonizers to be the natural-born local rulers, while the Hutus were deemed to occupy the role of structure and subservience. In many cases, colonizers replaced Hutu chieftaincies with Tutsi authorities. The distinction among the various groups were racialized into hierarchies that didn't exist in the same way, but here with Europeans at the apex, the Tutsis in the middle and the Hutus at the bottom, with the Twa on the periphery. We know that one of the ways that the colonial state reinforced ethnic divisions and hierarchy was with the issuance of identity cards. Only Tutus were allowed employment in the colonial administration, and the army and the best jobs in all sectors under the hegemony of the colonial state were given to some in that group. And of course, this story is not a new story. We see this throughout the continent in African context, but elsewhere, it's not new. Rwandans were inculcated with the belief through colonial institutions, in particular the education system, the church, the army. In these ways, Tutsi identity gradually became synonymous with privileges of wealth and power. In the waning days of colonialism, however, the Belgians turned against the Tutsis in the wake of the fervor of political independence sweeping across Africa. As the Hutu upper class clamored for more political power, Belgians were concerned with diverting attention from themselves and worked to promote the Tutsis as the object of attack. The Tutsis, as the object of attack. The politics of decolonization thus led to an inversion of social power that ultimately left the colonial apparatus intact. Rather than dismantle the apartheid structure of government or reverse the practices of racial discrimination based on ethnicity, the Hutu majority then were known to have kept such social orders intact. For example, the system of ethnic identity cards was continued for the purpose of preventing Tutsis from entering the military service or governmental service with this new regime. And during the Second Republic, Rwanda bowed to the demands of Hutu extremists. Ethnic discrimination against Tutsis intensified. Death squads were formed in the military and among civil servants, and the Tutsis were maligned as vermin, cockroaches who should be crushed without mercy. So of course we know this narrative that the propaganda spread through newspapers and the killer radio stations urged people to support Hutuism. And it was this genocidal philosophy, this narrative, that viewed Tutsis as foreigners who had been invaders, narrativized as enslavers of Hutus, stealers of land, and killers. The basic tenet of this belief system was that by killing every member of every Tutsi generation, the Hutus would regain what they saw as land lost in the 16th century Tutsi invasion, what they saw as the 16th century Tutsi invasion. And the problem, of course, with this narrative and the emergence of so many narratives from a context that was so deeply fraught historically, is that this narrative not only suggested a Tutsi invasion in the 16th century, which doesn't help, but we've certainly seen that narrative before elsewhere, but it also disregards the complex origins and waves of settlement of Hutu and Tutsis in Rwanda and the area, and omits the history between the 16th and 20th century, including the role played by European colonizers. So we know this is well established in the literature, and what these narratives and the nomenclature related to who the victims and perpetrator of the 1994 mass atrocity violence in Rwanda are was certainly driven by legal parameters of what is or is not a genocide. For where prior to 1994 there wasn't an equivalent term for genocide in Kinyarwanda, the definition of genocide that emerged in international legal circles, and I quote, the act, in terms of the ICTR, the act committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, or ethnic, or racial, or ethnic, or religious group, end quote, created a form of encapsulation that didn't fully correspond with all of the histories, the events, the categories, and the complex persons that Hutus and Tutsis were and are. And some of the challenges had to do with who was the protected group. Even the ICTR judges grappled with whether Tutsis were a racial group and whether this was an objective fact or a subjective perception. Now this point is not to deny racial genocide happened. Of course, this isn't the point that I'm making here. I make this point to highlight that even legal actors struggled with how this culminated in various decisions, including the ICTR judicial notice of 2006. And this is where the ICTR tried to advance an understanding of the genocide as beyond dispute and no longer requiring further proof. We might also think about the 2018 UNGA vote to amend Rwandan genocide with the genocide against the Tutsis on its annual April 7th observance. Now these decisions, these judicial decisions, speak to the challenge of legal categories, given the kinds of histories that we know of the region and so many regions across our globe. So they speak to the challenge of legal categories to fully hold deeply complex, fraught social realities and the need for further declaration or performativities to fix them in place, to concretize them, to create them as a fixed thing, as an object. So here, one of the issues to consider is when and how legal logics are and might severely constrain the imagination of radical alternatives to social rectification. Instead, in the aftermath of genocide, the legal mechanism that emerged to broker political transformation continued this refusal to acknowledge the historical antecedents to the atrocities. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the ICTR, was created to adjudicate the crimes of the Rwandan genocide, with an emphasis on bringing those most responsible to justice. However, the legal purview of the tribunal was extremely limited, with temporal jurisdiction over serious violations of international human rights law committed only between the period of the 1st January 1994 to the 31st of December 1994. The narrative surrounding the court's work purported to end impunity and deliver justice, but had very limited, if any, ability to address the roots of violence beyond the temporal jurisdiction. Despite acknowledging some relevance to the colonial history and laying the foundations for genocidal violence that unfolded, the ICTR Appeals Chamber ruled that no facts predating or postdating 1994 could be used to support a count in the indictment. It ordered withdrawal of all references to facts and crimes prior to 1994 from specific counts of indictments. Restricting the ICTR's jurisdiction to 1994 precluded consideration of pre-genocidal acts by Hutus or the culpability of foreign agents for their historic role, while also preventing accountability for atrocities committed by Tutsi political operatives of the RPFA. Such technical temporal limitations then allowed the ICTR to avoid the redress of historic crimes that seeded the structural condition that make contemporary violence possible. And of course, to wrap up this section, legal principles such as the law for non-retroactivity protected the colonial powers from accountability, ultimately furthering the entrenchment of the status quo and the power relations. Just as transitional justice speech acts performing forgiveness and reconciliation, individualizing trauma and healing were ineffective in addressing inequality, so too were these legal justice mechanisms which sought to individualize culpability within a circumscribed post-1994 or within a circumscribed 1994 period. The ICTR trials may have played a role in symbolizing international consequences for high-ranking leaders, so establishing norms. However, what it didn't do was to propose the terms for widespread transformation of inequality in daily life. The problematic relationship between the rise of a language and mechanism of transitional justice and the terms of international accountability shows us that both adopted tools that were meant to serve as a domain for all, but allowed law's temporality to shape the ways in which those tools would be used. So now, in reflecting on the predominant frameworks of international justice, what do we do when the legal tools available to us don't provide the emancipatory possibilities to address structural inequality that still persists? One step is to advance a new analytic that would move us beyond empty speech acts or categories and temporal constraints of contemporary justice mechanisms, and instead advance a set of practices toward a new agenda for justice. That agenda begins with critical knowledge tools through which to understand the intersection of politics of law and the structural violence of categories and principles that are not life-producing. To do this requires rethinking our notion of what it means to be human, in relation to understanding structural inequality and collective responsibility for justice. Now, when we ask the question, and our speaker last night also asked the question, what does it mean to be human? What is the humanity in justice work? Well, one of the precursors to thinking about what the human is, and I'm going to move to the wrap-up here, is that humanism is commonly thought of as a secular worldview that prioritizes human freedom, democracy, and reason over religious devotion and rule. The American Humanist Association, for example, defines it as a progressive philosophy of life that without theism or other supernatural beliefs affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to a greater good. Humanism is foundational to modern legal and political ideas about the liberal subject, or the idea that human beings are individuals entitled to specific rights and liberties. And while that definition may seem innocuous, the roots of philosophical humanism are far more fraught as it emerged out of the Copernican Revolution and the European Renaissance of the 14th to the 17th centuries. Its European proponents wanted to dislodge the role of religious institutions and thought, particularly theological conceptualizations of causality in favor of reason and rationality. They saw freedom of thought as a key to developing a new idea of man, quote, as a secular political subject. But in doing so, they also claimed white European views of the world as universally true and superior to all other possible views, and used legality to establish those terms, those formats, and the temporalities through which imperialism became legal. This laid the groundwork for central contradictions that we see in liberal democracies today, the valuing of the protection of freedom and human rights alongside histories of colonial violence through legality and other forms of unjust labor, imperialism, and exploitation of nature. This project, that is humanism, ultimately legitimated hierarchies of humanity that produced mechanisms of othering through ethnicity, through race, modern classificatory principles and tools of domination. So the core of humanism, therefore, is not the noble protection of human freedom from religion, but a secular imperialism that's actually grounded in white supremacy. So the challenge to humanism is to adopt a radical humanism that approaches a form of being that moves us beyond these constraints. Thinking otherwise requires that we take up these questions not only in an anti-colonial approach or a decolonial approach, but in the wake of the defeat of the post-war, post-colonial liberal settlement. So in this case, thinking international justice otherwise involves continuing the work of the anti-colonial projects without simply adopting the false humanisms and universalisms of the European Enlightenment. The framework that better reflects life-preserving freedoms might be found in a more radical conceptualization, a radical humanism. Take, for example, the humanism articulated across Africa through the concept of the term Ubuntu. This humanism describes the notion that we are, in Nelson Mandela's words, human only through the humanity of others. Our achievements rest in the labor and successes of others, and likewise, our failures are collective experiences and responsibilities. In the Ubuntu worldview, there really is no individual. Rather, we exist and come into being through, with, and for others. This is the humanity. It involves identifying a radical humanism not as a method, but as a political horizon and critical practice, predicated on overturning a foundation premised on the relationship between reason and those without the capacity to be reasonable. It involves moving beyond such Enlightenment distinctions and discourses of inclusiveness within a liberal order to an expanded category of humans in which the wake of the never-finished effects of colonialism, imperialism, the plantation, of racism, of nationalism, of class distinction can take center stage. So today, the relationship between liberalism's freedoms, histories of violence, and the erasure of historical culpability exists alongside the very settler colonialism that has entrenched modernity in particular ways. Thus, our contemporary notion of justice has always existed in relation to the triad of freedom, rights, and liberty, around which a particular imaginary of the state has laid claim. Yet we now recognize that the tools that have emerged from that past, tools that have never been able to acknowledge or rectify structural inequality, nor give back what was taken, will never produce liberation, in fact. Thinking otherwise through radical humanism thus seeks to move beyond these neoliberal values and their nefarious and damaging effects on the human well-being. It involves the formation of methodologies for knowledge production that respect a commitment to improving our world, while simultaneously grappling within a new domain of negotiation around what it means to be human. This negotiation demands principles that reshape intellectual knowledge production and in the process provide us with the new tools and foundations to advance justice in the 21st century. At this first inaugural Summer Institute, during which we're rethinking futures of justice beyond the law, the work before us is vast, but is actually very exciting. Our agenda this week is one that moves us toward the building of new foundations for thinking otherwise, not in The Hague or in Brussels or Geneva, but in Kigali, Rwanda, in Africa. And today, Rwanda is at a critical moment to reposition itself in relation to liberal legality. Like bell hooks talking back to the violence, the subordination, the pain, there's a great promise for Rwanda today to continue to talk back, for us all to talk back to the hegemony of liberal legality that so pervades our justice logic, our frameworks, and our categories. On the one hand, Rwanda has become an object of international criminal legal logics with a recent history of humanitarian intervention and the ICTR. On the other hand, there's a concerted effort to talk back to such objectifying pressure, to assert a movement from object to subject. From Rwanda's recent hosting of the Commonwealth Summit, to Rwanda's offering to host asylum seekers here by drawing attention to the failures of the UK, Israel, and others fulfilling their human rights obligations, to Rwanda's innovative approaches to mass violence through Gacaca courts, to a range of key innovations related to the annual April 7th to April 13th anniversary, where Rwandans are called on to give back to others, as well as the phenomenal and importantly innovative last Saturday morning, umuganda requirement, in which people spend the last Saturday of every morning, contributing to community work. The examples are significant, and like many examples in the Global South, innovation, creative thinking, and knowledge about justice and rectification of injustice actually abounds. It's right there in front of us. For if international legal tools, methods, and mechanisms cannot by now promote the possibilities for real change in our world, if at times they function as non-performatives and cannot offer life-preserving needs, then we need to think creatively about how and on what terms transformation can take place. And in that light, for our purposes, to ask, what are the new analytics for reframing justice in the 21st century? This is a moment to sit in the innovation, the needs, the possibilities. It's a moment to think otherwise about justice's future. Sarah, I'm good for that last slide. So toward this performative end then, this transformative end, I'd like to put forward the following 6 principles to inform and stimulate our discussions this week. And in many ways, I see them as central to an agenda for thinking justice otherwise, to imagining a future where histories of inequality assume center stage and matter deeply, where experiences of suffering and pain currently elided from transitional justice formats can be heard and acknowledged. The first principle that I think is key here in thinking justice otherwise is the principle of abnegation, and this is a concept that I take from my colleague Siba Grovagi, which is quite powerful, and it is a principle that affirms a commitment to post-colonial and to rethinking the settler state, the colonial settler state, and a commitment to post-colonial and post-settler state principles. That is the principle of abnegation, which means to renounce and to give up something. And in the invocation of the renouncement and giving up something, it speaks to giving up things like land, or demanding land reform, the rights to ownership, rights to entitlement to the things that we claim we own. And so much of this work comes from our indigenous brothers and sisters in North America, but it really is about abnegation. If we want to see a different world, what will we give up for that? What does that look like, actually? So that it's not just non-performative, but it's actually a way in which we think about what we are willing to give up of ourselves. And we see some of that. I really love what I'm seeing in Rwanda in relation to that, and we can talk more about that by way of the community work and the requirement to come together and to contribute to one's community. The second has to do with multiple trajectories of truth. And this, of course, recognizes that liberal legality is not an objective or emancipatory tool. Instead, we need principles that involve unearthing of experience in a way that doesn't begin or end with the reassurance of truth. Instead, it involves people's own relationship to truth in relation to their experience of violence, that there is no objective truth in and of itself, but that that we accept that the reassurance of truth is negotiated. And this is a very difficult point for us to take on, especially as we reflect on the principles of transitional justice and the need to know and the need for truth. And so this is a topic we can continue to discuss. What is truth? Is there a truth? Whose truth? From what vantage point? The third is beyond individualism. And I talked about that in relation to Ubuntu today. The principle departs from the glorification of the singular individual engaged in the pursuit of freedom, happiness, and liberty. It involves a commitment to recognizing the individual not through presumptions of individual rights, but rather in membership with communities of the human or of human relations. The fourth, very quickly, because I know my time is up, is beyond universality. And then, of course, this is no stranger to us. There have been well-established critiques of universality at this stage. And there are some interesting innovations around translocality and other ways to think about universality. But certainly starting from a beyond of universality is one of the starting places, despite the UN Declaration for Human Rights. And then the fifth, the variability of justice. This isn't new. It asserts the importance of recognizing that notions of justice are negotiated over time and place, and the appropriateness of justice terms are the basis for determining whether a norm will exist and be claimed as justice. And then the final, the validation of all forms of social thought. This is really part of the exciting move toward knowledge from the South, the recognition of theory building that may look very different. We may see it in proverbs and stories and adages, etc., and we need to recognize them as theories, theories of law, theories of justice, theories of humanity. And Ubuntu is one place to start, but there's so many other places to go with that. So these 6 principles then, to end, speak to the need to take up various scholarly traditions and structural inequality as a form of justice politics. This move speaks to one of the most difficult issues of our time, the dismantling of the comfort of whiteness and its assumptions about the workings of science, of data, of theory building as only recognizable within histories of Eurocentric knowledge as the ultimate way to organize our world. These principles center the demand to transform what is accepted as knowledge, taking us beyond universality and certainly beyond the limits of legal temporality or law's temporalities. So to conclude, recall how we began. A Rwandan in exile is convicted of complicity of genocide. An American tenured white male professor voluntarily exits the Western Academy as a protest over political wokeness. What might these two lives have in common? They are each agents within systems that would seek to relate to them as distinct individuals, immoral and moral, one brought to trial to face accountability for mass killing, the other making much of his power to slip away from the collective accountability for his participation in white supremacy. So these two men of the world allow us to see the structural conditions each man navigated in his life, the systems they both deployed in the cultures of justice by which they felt persecuted. Both are symptoms of a larger problem. The conviction of Busabaruta points to the limits of the law in relation to the politics of accountability over the longue durée. And the early retirement of Manson is about the academy in flux and the results of scholars talking back. Both examples allow us to see that we must take seriously the histories, the structural order, the moralities, and the imaginaries that shape the decision-making and how these decisions are legitimized with the moral force of the past. These are articulations of power. They structure the future possibilities in particular ways, all the while exasperating pre-existing inequalities and differences in responsibility, accountability, and obligation, as well as the making of histories. So to end, by expanding justice beyond what is strictly recognized as the legal, we can see how, through principled commitments, we can prioritize the core values that are life-producing. One key part of this is realizing that reconsidering humanism is not just about decolonizing our fields. It is about reshaping the problematic foundational ideas of the human as a liberal subject that has been ingrained in justice discourses for far too long. Instead, we need to ponder who and what is included in or excluded from narrow individualistic human rights domains of liberal legality. Rethinking the future of justice is about rethinking and centering justice, equity, and the reduction of harm. It involves taking radical humanism seriously. This is the future of justice. Thank you.